Philosophy of Mind, Lecture 12. Consciousness and the Physical World, Part 2.
In the last lecture, we began our discussion of the nature of consciousness, in particular the qualitative aspects of conscious states known as qualia, and we looked at two arguments by Thomas Nagel and Colin McGinn that we simply cannot understand in principle how these things might fit into the otherwise purely physical world. As such, both arguments strongly suggest that physicalism is false, and thus that some version of dualism is true. We continue that theme in this lecture by looking at arguments due respectively to the Princeton, City of University, New York philosopher Saul Kripke and the Australian thinker Frank Jackson. While these new arguments seem on the surface quite different from those of Nagel and McGinn, especially Kripke's as we'll see, in the end they might all come down to the same single basic idea, an idea which in fact traces all the way back, ultimately, to the original dualist of our modern period, namely Descartes, or so at least I'll suggest. So let's get right to Kripke. Saul Kripke. Kripke is one of the most fascinating figures in contemporary philosophy, and indeed a recent poll of professional philosophers concluded that Kripke ranks amongst the top 10 most important philosophers of the past 2 centuries. Born in 1940, he was a child prodigy in mathematics and logic, making important contributions to each while still in high school. Then, while still just a sophomore in college at Harvard, he taught a graduate-level logic course at one of the world's leading institutions for mathematics and science, MIT. Most unusual of all for a professional philosopher, he never obtained a higher degree above his bachelor's. His is that rare case of a major contemporary academic philosopher without a PhD. He taught for many years at Princeton and is currently Distinguished Professor at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. And in fact, the City University has established an entire academic center, the Saul Kripke Center, for the study of his work. Now, Kripke's contributions to philosophy are in many areas, including logic, metaphysics, language, and mind. For our purposes, we'll look at one of his important metaphysical ideas, and then see how that idea supports his very influential argument against the possibility of fitting consciousness into a purely physical world. Metaphysical background to Kripke's argument. Here's a thesis versions of which have popped up at various times in this course. Mental states are identical to brain states. As we've seen, in particular during Lecture 4's discussion of the identity theory, this is not a merely casual claim. Philosophers have fairly strong ideas about the conditions under which one kind of thing counts as identical to another kind of thing. Thus, we've also seen an important test or criterion for determining identity called Leibniz's law. According to that law, if something X is identical to something Y, then whatever is true of X must also be true of Y. Or in the reverse direction, if there's something true of X that isn't true of Y, then X must not be identical to Y. Much of our discussion of the identity theory back then involved exploring various properties which, it was claimed, mental states had but brain states lacked, or vice versa, in order to determine whether Leibniz's law supported or rejected the identity between them. What Kripke now offers is some additional insight into the nature of identity, and indeed ultimately an explanation of just why Leibniz's law is not only an intuitive criterion for identity, but also a useful and legitimate one. Kripke's basic claim is this: sentences asserting an identity between two kinds of things, if true, express necessary truths, and if false, express necessary falsehoods. Sounds rather innocent on the surface, perhaps, but very deep thoughts are contained therein, extraction of which will take a few minutes. For simplicity of discussion, we'll focus on the truths part of it, leaving out discussion of the falsehoods. Necessary versus contingent truths. First, philosophers distinguish between two different senses of truth, or perhaps two modes of truth. A given true sentence might be necessarily true or merely contingently true. To say that a sentence is necessarily true is to say that it couldn't possibly be false, that there are no conceivable circumstances under which it would or could be or become false, that denying the sentence would lead to some sort of contradiction. Prime candidates for necessary truths are usually mathematical and logical truths. That 2 plus 3 equals 5, for example, doesn't merely happen to be true, it has to be true. We cannot conceive of circumstances under which 2 plus 3 would not equal 5. Thus the sentence 2 plus 3 equals 5 is a necessary truth. In contrast, most other kinds of true sentences seem to express merely contingent truth. To say that a sentence is contingently true is to say that, although it does happen to be true, it didn't or doesn't have to be true. There are conceivable circumstances under which it would or could be or become false. Denying it might give you a falsehood, but it doesn't involve any contradictions. Consider the sentence, for example, Andrew Pessin is wearing a blue shirt today. If I am wearing a blue shirt at the time that sentence is uttered, then of course it's a true sentence. But even if it's true, there are conceivable circumstances under which it wouldn't have been true. Had I freely chosen this morning not to wear that shirt, for example, it wouldn't have been a true sentence. So such a sentence seems to be, while true, merely a contingent truth. So the first part of Kripke's point about identity is this, that sentences expressing identities are, if true, necessary truths. Or to put it slightly differently, where X and Y are in fact identical, then they're not merely contingently, but necessarily identical. But why, you might ask, should we believe this to be so? It seems pretty easy, after all, to imagine cases where some identity appears to be merely a contingent identity. Recall the classic example of the morning star and the evening star. Sure, the morning star, that bright object often seen in the morning sky, is in fact identical to the evening star, the bright object often seen in the evening sky, but can't we easily conceive of circumstances in which it didn't have to be? That the solar system and the laws of physics have the forms they do seems perfectly contingent. We can easily conceive their having taken on different forms. But then we can easily conceive a circumstance in which Venus rises in the morning and thus earns the title the morning star, while some other bright object rises in the evening, earning the title the evening star. And that would be a circumstance in which the morning star was not identical to the evening star. In which case, we couldn't say that the actual identity between the two in our actual case is a necessary one, for there are conceivable circumstances where the two things are not identical. So why should we believe Kripke's claim that identities are necessary? Brief argument for the necessity of identity. Kripke responds to the counterexample just sketched by agreeing that it's setting out in the right direction, but claiming that it fails to get where it's aiming to go. The right direction is this. It's attempting to generate a case of contingent identity. That is, it's trying to show that two things which are in actual fact identical, the morning star and the evening star, did not have to be identical. And the way to show that is, of course, to sketch some possible situation in which they aren't identical. But the failing to get there is this. The situation just generated, Kripke claims, is not one where the morning star is not identical to the evening star. For, he argues to the contrary, given that they are identical in actual fact, it's not possible to conceive of a circumstance where they aren't identical. In actual fact, the morning star is Venus, and the evening star is also Venus. To say they are identical is to say, in effect, that there's just one object to which we've given two different names. If we focus on that object itself and not on the names, then we'll realize it doesn't even make any sense to imagine the actual morning star, Venus, being different from the actual evening star, also Venus. For that would be to imagine a scenario in which Venus, the actual physical planet, is not Venus. And the scenario we sketched a moment ago is most certainly not that. Sure, we can imagine that some other planetary object, let's call it Titan, arises regularly in the evening. And sure, in that scenario, Titan would have been called the evening star, and people there would use the names the morning star and the evening star for different objects, Venus and Titan, respectively. But that is not a scenario in which the morning star, as we use the term, namely for Venus, is different from the evening star as we use the term, also for Venus. It's instead a scenario where Venus is not identical to Titan, not a scenario where Venus is somehow not identical to Venus. As we use the terms, then, the morning star is necessarily identical to the evening star. For Venus is both the morning star and the evening star, and Venus is necessarily identical to itself. Just because there are scenarios where Venus might act differently, such as not appear in the evening, doesn't disturb that fact. And so, Kripke concludes, identity is necessary after all, not contingent. If X and Y are identical, they're necessarily identical, and there's no conceivable circumstances under which they're not identical. Kripke's argument against the identity of conscious states with brain states. With the metaphysical heavy lifting behind us, thankfully, Kripke's main argument now becomes fairly straightforward. We'll take it now as established, his principle of the necessity of identity, namely that if something X is identical to something Y, then it's necessarily the case that X is identical to Y. If one thing is identical to another, it's necessarily the case that they're identical, which means that there's no conceivable circumstances under which one could be present without the other. But then that, in turn, means this. If you can generate a conceivable circumstance in which one is present without the other, if there are conceivable circumstances under which this is the case, then the two are not identical after all. And that's the key strategy Kripke turns towards the mind-body case. He focuses on qualia, in particular on the nature of pain, the sensations of pain, the paradigm subjective mental states. Now, there is much scientific discussion of the role of certain kinds of brain structures called C fibers in our experience of pain. Stimulation and activity of C fibers seems to play a key role in generating human pain sensations. And so Kripke explores the question of whether pain states or the sensation of pain may be said to be identical with the activation of these C fibers. The argument now is simplicity itself. We can easily conceive of circumstances in which the firing of C fibers might occur without the sensation of pain, and even perhaps of the occurrence of pain without the firing of C fibers. Just think carefully about what you mean when you speak of brain structures and activities, such as the firing of neurons. And think carefully about what you mean when you refer to pain. The former are perfectly physical, involving molecules, electricity, and so forth. The latter is entirely a matter of feeling and sensation, what it feels like that's so characteristic of pains. Now, nothing about the idea of molecules moving and electricity flowing suggests anything about feelings or sensations. We can easily conceive of all sorts of physical phenomena that we're not even tempted to imagine as involving consciousness, say the flow of electricity in the wires of a house, or the explosion of a star in the heavens. And nothing about the idea of feelings or sensations suggests anything about any particular physical activities. We can easily conceive of ourselves having sensations even without any knowledge of anything about our brains. We can even easily conceive of the possibility that we might be purely dreaming or be purely disembodied minds feeling sensations without anything like the physical world existing as we believe it to be. But to conceive of this is precisely to conceive of a scenario in which the sensations might exist while the physical substrate for them does not. Nobody is claiming here that in actual fact we are merely dreaming or we are merely disembodied minds. What matters is only that the idea is conceivable, imaginable, without any contradictions. For if conscious states were identical to brain states, then by Kripke's principle of the necessity of identity, there could be no conceivable circumstances in which one exists without the other. But if it is even conceivable that we're disembodied minds, even if in actual fact we aren't, then it's conceivable that conscious states could exist without corresponding physical states. And that means, by Kripke's metaphysical principle, that the two are not identical. And so, a basic and quite general principle of metaphysics about the nature of identity seems to entail that physicalism is false. Kripke's argument in two earlier issues. First, we mentioned earlier that Kripke's identity principle helps explain why Leibniz's law is such an intuitive and useful criterion for identity. We can now see why. For if identity is necessary, then wherever some x is identical to some y, there will be no conceivable scenarios in which x may be separated from y. Wherever x is, y is, and vice versa. But then there could also be no conceivable scenarios in which x has any properties y lacks, or vice versa, for that would require separating x and y in some way. So the necessity of identity explains precisely why identical things must share all their properties, and thus why, if you can find something true of x but not of y, x and y must not be identical. And second, Kripke's argument also illuminates some of the earlier ideas we've explored, in particular in Lecture 5's discussion of functionalism. For suppose Kripke is right, that conscious mental states are, in general, separately conceivable from brain states and thus not identical to them. If so, then there are conceivable scenarios in which either there are very different correlations between the mental and the physical than currently obtained, and or in which there might be physical events, including neural events just like our own, that occur without any sort of conscious mental states accompanying them whatsoever. But now scenarios of the first sort with different mental-physical correlations would include cases of inverted qualia, to use our earlier phrase, scenarios where perhaps different individuals have very different conscious experiences even in exactly the same causal circumstances. In our example in Lecture 5, we imagined that two people might both call a banana yellow, even though what yellow looks like to them differs dramatically. Similarly, scenarios of the second sort, where consciousness is lacking altogether, would include cases of absent qualia, to use our earlier phrases, or, more colorfully so to speak, of zombies, beings exactly like us in all causal respects, yet for whom there's no there. The lights are on, but there's nobody home. So we can now appreciate that it's Kripke's principle about the necessity of identity, and therefore the contingency of non-identity, which underlies the conceivability of both of these scenarios from earlier. As we'll see at the end of this lecture, Kripke's principle might also be what underlies, ultimately, the earlier anti-physicalist arguments of both Nagel and McGinn, as well as the argument of Frank Jackson's, to which we now turn. Frank Jackson's The Knowledge Argument. As you can no doubt tell by now, philosophers love thought experiments. If scientific theories are tested against empirical experiments, philosophical theories are often tested against thought experiments, scenarios designed to probe our intuitions about whatever the subject matter. And few thought experiments have engaged the imagination of contemporary philosophers of mind more than that devised by Australian philosopher Frank Jackson. In an article originally published in 1982, Jackson argues that physicalism is false. Physicalism, as he defines it, is the view that the physical facts about the world are all the facts there are. So for a physicalist, all the allegedly mental facts about the world, concerning the existence and nature of intentional states and qualia, ultimately must be reduced to or identified with physical facts, for once the complete physical story of the world is told, there's just nothing to be left over. But according to Jackson, there are facts about conscious mental experiences which would be left over after even the complete physical story is told. To see why, let's turn to the thought experiment. Mary the neuroscientist. Imagine, Jackson invites us, the following. Quote, Mary is a brilliant scientist who, for whatever reason, is forced to investigate the world from a black and white room via a black and white television monitor. She specializes in the neurophysiology of vision and acquires, let us suppose, all the physical information there is to obtain about what goes on when we see ripe tomatoes or the sky, and use terms like red, blue, and so on. She discovers, for example, just which wavelength combinations from the sky stimulate the retina, and exactly how this produces, via the central nervous system, the contraction of the vocal cords and expulsion of air from the lungs that results in uttering the sentence, "The sky is blue." End quote. In short, we're to imagine that Mary knows everything physical there is to know about how the brain processes color information and even produces our color-oriented behavior. But now, Jackson continues, quote, what will happen when Mary is released from her black and white room or is given a color television monitor? Will she learn anything or not? It seems just obvious that she will learn something about the world and our visual experience of it. But then it's inescapable that her previous knowledge was incomplete. But by hypothesis, she had all the physical information. Ergo, there is more to have than that, and physicalism is false. End quote. Upon release, Jackson suggests, Mary will learn something, in particular about other people's visual experiences. She will learn, for example, what red looks like, or what it's like to see red, to borrow our classic locutions. But we started with the premise that Mary already knew everything physical about the processes of color perception. So if she knew everything physical, and yet comes to learn something upon her release, it follows that there's more to know about the world than the physical. There must also, therefore, be non-physical facts about the world, facts that are essential to a complete theory of the world. And to say that, in effect, is to say that the facts about conscious experience do not fit into a purely physical theory of the world, or in short, consciousness is not physical. Jackson conveniently summarizes what he calls the knowledge argument as follows. Premise 1. Mary, pre-release, knows everything physical there is to know about other people. Premise 2. Mary, pre-release, does not know everything there is to know about other people because she learns something about them on her release. Conclusion, therefore, 3. There are truths about people which escape the physicalist story. 3 quick points about the knowledge argument. First, while the thought experiment is framed in terms of color perception, we easily could generate other versions dealing with the other senses, taste, hearing, bodily sensations, and so on. So its conclusion really concerns qualia and consciousness in general, not just color. Second point. The knowledge argument clearly shares much with the arguments from Nagel and McGinn in particular. Each claims that the physical facts about the world don't explain everything there is to be explained about qualia and consciousness. As such, many of the responses to the knowledge argument which we're about to explore might also be applicable to Nagel and McGinn's arguments. And finally, third, the knowledge argument has generated a quite large literature, including an entire anthology collecting some of the best responses to it, along with Jackson's own replies to those responses. In what follows, we'll explore just a few of the most important physicalist responses to his argument and see what lessons, if any, we might draw. Here, quickly, are 3 general response strategies, and we'll follow that by elaborating on each in some detail. First, a physicalist might simply deny that Mary, on her release, will actually gain any knowledge at all. Second, a physicalist might admit that she gains knowledge, but argue that this is so only because she hadn't worked out all the implications of what she already did know. And if so, then the physicalist story would ultimately contain the facts about consciousness after all. And third, a physicalist might admit that Mary gains new knowledge, but deny that it's the kind of knowledge of new facts that's ultimately relevant to the debate about physicalism. So let's elaborate on each of these in turn. Physicalist response number 1. Deny Mary gains knowledge. Jackson's thought experiment is admittedly quite strong in pumping our intuitions the way he wants them to be pumped. It seems easy to imagine that Mary knows everything physical, and to imagine that she then learns something on her release, thus reaching Jackson's conclusion. But of course now, physical science and neuroscience are very far from knowing everything physical there is to know about color perception. And in any case, most of us ourselves don't even know much of what neuroscience does already know. But then, this first response goes, how can we be so sure that a future neuroscientist, possessing far more advanced knowledge than ours, would actually learn something? Perhaps in knowing all the physical processes of color perception, Mary would in fact already know what red looks like, or what it's like to see red, even if she herself hasn't seen red. And if she would already know this, then knowing all the physical facts would be sufficient for knowing all there is to know, and we'd lose Jackson's argument that facts about consciousness are non-physical facts. Indeed, Daniel Dennett makes this point vividly by imagining an alternative outcome to the thought experiment. Imagine, he suggests, that Mary's captors decide to play a trick on her. On her release, they offer her a banana which they've dyed blue to see if she would notice. But then imagine that Mary doesn't skip a beat, and she says, "Hey guys, what's up with the blue banana?" For perhaps in knowing all the physical facts about color perception, Mary would know what yellow looks like and what blue looks like, despite never having seen these colors, and would further know that bananas are supposed to be the former and not the latter. This outcome, Dennett suggests, is just as plausible as Jackson's, but of course speaks to the opposite conclusion. Dennett's point also speaks to the limits of thought experiments, for it may not be so easy to fulfill their conditions, here, to truly imagine what's involved in knowing all the physical facts, and similarly, it may not be so obvious what the appropriate or correct response to them should be. Is Jackson's or Dennett's completion of the scenario the more plausible? Will Mary learn something or not? It's hard to say if all we've got to go on are our imaginations. This physicalist response to the knowledge argument also sets the stage for the next possible response. Physicalist response number 2. Admit that Mary gains knowledge, but only because she hadn't worked out all the implications of what she already did know. This next strategy grants that Mary will learn something on her release, but denies that this means that physicalism is false. Why? Because it suggests that simply learning something doesn't mean that what you learn isn't already contained in some sense in what you already knew. To see this, note that we often may know a given sentence to be true, and yet not know all the sentences that are logically entailed by the one we do know. So, for example, most everyone knows that a triangle is a three-sided closed figure. But it might only be mathematically inclined people who also know various mathematical truths about triangles, that their angles add up to 180 degrees, that their largest side is opposite their largest angle, and so on. And yet it turns out that these mathematical truths about triangles logically follow from the very definition of triangles as three-sided closed figures. Given this definition, those sentences have to be true, and indeed can be proven to be true by any competent mathematician. Now, upon doing or observing such a proof, you might come to learn these new truths or facts about triangles. But since those facts simply follow from the definition of a triangle, you learn those new facts merely by thinking about the facts you already knew. We might say that those new facts were already contained in the old facts, even if you, were the mathematician, hadn't worked them out explicitly yet. So perhaps then, Mary the neuroscientist wouldn't know what it's like to see red merely on the basis of knowing all about neural firings and the like. But that might only be because working out what it's like to see red on that basis might be very difficult, or might not even be something she'd think of doing until she herself experienced red, and not because the information about conscious experiences, the facts about what it's like to see red, are not already contained in the physical information. And that presumably would be enough for the physicalist. If the physical facts ultimately contained all the facts there are, just as the definition of a triangle contains all the facts there are about triangles, then that seems adequate to say that the physical facts are the basis of all reality. Let's turn now to physicalist response number 3. Mary gains new knowledge, but not knowledge of new facts. The last response strategy we'll look at also grants that Mary learns something upon her release, but denies that this disturbs physicalism in a slightly different way from the previous response. To see this strategy at work, consider how philosopher Paul Churchland from the University of California, San Diego, whose work we'll discuss in some detail in Lecture 14, summarizes Jackson's argument. He puts it this way. Premise 1. Mary, pre-release, knows everything there is to know about brain states and their properties. Premise 2. Mary does not know everything there is to know about sensations and their properties. Therefore, conclusion 3, by Leibniz's law, sensations and their properties are not identical to brain states and their properties. But now, Churchland objects, the type of knowledge involved in premise 1 is different from the type of knowledge involved in premise 2. What makes premise 1 true is that Mary has what we might call discursive knowledge about the brain, knowledge that can be expressed in words and sentences. That's what she's learned in reading books and listening to lectures over her black and white television about how the brain works. But what makes premise 2 true is something else, a kind of perceptual knowledge, what we might call knowledge by acquaintance of the relevant brain states and their properties. So sure, prior to her release, Mary knows all the true sentences about how the brain works, as premise 1, now clarified, asserts. And true, prior to her release, she does not herself have any direct acquaintance with the relevant brain states. She hasn't had the relevant sensations herself. But this doesn't mean that the sensations cannot be identified with those brain states. It merely means that, although she knows all the physical facts about the brain processes, she simply hasn't undergone those brain processes herself and so hasn't experienced them. The sensations could just well be brain processes, although brain processes she hasn't herself experienced. And if they could just be brain processes after all, then physicalism has not actually been challenged. Or to put that a slightly different way, all that's really going on when Mary leaves her room is that she gains a different kind of knowledge, or maybe better, a different way of knowing about the brain states and properties she already knows about. But these are not two different kinds of facts to be known, one of which she knows before release and the other of which she only learns after her release. They're just two different ways of knowing or accessing the very same facts. So what Mary gains on release is not knowledge of new facts, but simply a new way of knowing the same old facts she already knew. And if she doesn't learn any new facts upon her release, the physicalist thesis that all the facts in the world are physicalist facts remains untouched. We end our discussion of Jackson's argument by giving the physicalist the last word, but that's only because someone has to get the last word, and our time is too short to discuss how Jackson and others reply to these various physicalist responses. We'll conclude today's lecture, and with it, this segment of the course focusing on qualia instead, with a brief bit of reflection on the four arguments of this lecture and the previous one. These four arguments were due to Nagel, McGinn, Kripke, and Jackson, and they happen to be some of the most influential arguments supporting the claim that consciousness, qualia, does not fit into the purely physical world, and thus that physicalism is false in favor of some version of dualism. Nagel argued that we cannot understand how subjectivity could be constructed from the purely objective entities studied by physical science. McGinn argued that we cannot explain how qualia arise from brain properties by either direct or indirect observation or theorizing about the brain. Kripke argued that the necessity of identity, conjoined with the conceivable separability of the mental and physical, means that the mental cannot be identified with the physical. And finally, Jackson argued that a complete knowledge of the physical facts would leave us without all the facts, and so there must be non-physical facts. What all these arguments seem to have in common in the end is their reliance on what we can conceive or not, what we're capable of thinking about without invoking a contradiction. Nagel and McGinn claim that we cannot conceive how the subjective mental arises from the objective physical. Kripke claims that we can conceive of the mental being separate from the physical, and Jackson claims that in conceiving of the physical, we're simply not conceiving of the mental. And of course, we can now see that all of these arguments ultimately rely on Kripke's identity principle. It's precisely because identities are necessary that the distinguishable concepts of the mental and physical in play in all four arguments amount to an argument that the mental cannot be identified with the physical. But now, are such arguments, all of them based on the distinguishable concepts of mental and physical, good arguments? Historically speaking, what we're capable of conceiving and what we judge ourselves to be capable of conceiving may well change over time. No one can say what science will look like 100 years from now, much less 1,000 or 5,000. For all we know, it may be that future scientists will completely understand how the mental arises from the physical, and the only reason we cannot conceive it is that our knowledge and our concepts right now are just too primitive. That point, of course, is the essence of the first physicalist response to the knowledge argument that we were exploring a few minutes ago. So perhaps we can't say for sure what science will bring. But then again, here we are in the early 21st century, and we have to decide what we believe, given both our conceptual capacities and the information available to us at this time. And so, while we may not be able to take these four arguments as proving conclusively that the mental is distinct from the physical, they certainly go far towards showing that given what's available to us right now, given our understanding of the physical and the mental right now, we're both capable of conceiving them separately and incapable of conceiving how one could generate the other. And that's pretty good reason to accept that from where we currently stand, the mental appears to be distinct from the physical. And this idea that the separable conceivability of the mental and the physical supports their being non-identical, their being distinct, was of course one of Descartes' primary arguments for substance dualism, as we saw way back in Lecture 2. So, in the end, with Nagel and company's discussion of qualia, we've come rather full circle. Of course now, Descartes' dualism also left us with the problem of mind-body causation, as we saw in Lecture 7. Let's now come full circle on that one, too, by having a look at what contemporary philosophers say on the subject in our next lecture.
This ends Lecture 12. Remember to visit this course's website at www.modernscholar.com, where you'll find additional information about the lectures you just heard. If you borrowed this course from a public library and would like your own copy of the course guide for future reference, call Recorded Books at 1-800-636-3399, and we'll send you a free copy. A shipping charge will apply.